Everyone, and welcome to the 37th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indian and Northern Affairs.
Territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses from the National Council for Reconciliation Transitional Committee, who have joined us all in person in the committee room this morning as we study Bill C-29, and they will each have an opportunity to make a 5-minute statement. We have Mr. Mitch Case, we have Edith Cloutier, Rosemary Cooper, and Michael DeGagne. To ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline the usual rules that we follow here. Members or witnesses may speak in the language of their choice. Interpretation services are offered in English, French, and Inuktitut. Please be patient with the interpretation. There may be a delay, especially since the Inuktitut has to be translated into English first before it can be translated into French and vice versa. So
Désolé, Monsieur le Président.
Excuse me. Mrs. Gill wanted to intervene. She has raised her hand. Yes, Mrs. Gill, one moment. When I'm done, I will go to you directly.
Slowly and clearly. This will help our interpreters to translate what you have to say. And when you're not speaking, please put your microphone on mute. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. As I say, each of the witnesses today will be invited to make a 5-minute statement, and that'll be followed by questions for the remainder of the time. So before we start, Madame Gill, vous aviez un point à soulever?
Mrs. Gill? Thank you. I know that the witnesses are in the room, but I wanted to make sure that they know how the committee works to be able to understand the questions and interventions in French. Yes? Yes.
I would like to begin the initial statements, and I'll invite Madame or Ms. Cloutier to begin with her 5-minute statement. Ms. Cloutier, the microphone is yours.
Kwe, bonjour.
Kwe, good morning. I am thankful to be speaking to you on this unceded traditional Anishinaabe territory of my people. Thank you, Miigwech, for the invitation. It's a privilege to share this forum with my colleagues, Mitch, Mike, and Rosemary, from the National Reconciliation Council Transition Committee. Our committee was established on December the 16th, 2021, by the Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, Mark Miller. We would like to take this opportunity to thank the Minister for his confidence and for the invaluable support of his team members throughout our mandate. We would also like to acknowledge the contribution of Chief Wilton Littlechild, former Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the early stages of our committee's work. For the record, I was also a member, along with my colleague Mike, of the first interim council established in December 2017, which also included Mr. Jean Tayet, a lawyer from the Métis Nation, Mr. Max Fineday, representing the youth referred by the Assembly of First Nations, from the Inuit Nation, Mr. Clint Davis from the Economic Community, as well as Dr. Wilton Littlechild. And our mandate was, at the time, to develop recommendations to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada regarding the establishment of the National Reconciliation Council, more specifically, to see to the implementation of TRC, Calls to Action 53 and 54. In June 2018, we documented 25 recommendations from our work in a final report to the Minister. This included an engagement session that brought together nearly 30 participants from a variety of backgrounds in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous world in Canada. This report was also sent to national Indigenous organizations and made available to the general public on the Department of Crown Relations and Northern Affairs in June 2017. As for the members of the current Transition Committee, as of January 2022, we went to work. Our mandate involved to provide advice and guidance on the co-development of the legislative framework, to engage with Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups on the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation, and finally, to help support the establishment of the Council's Permanent Board of Directors. During the course of the mandate, we conducted targeted interviews with Indigenous and non-Indigenous experts, including lawyers, data experts, financial experts, governance and reconciliation specialists. The feedback and advice we received helped to enrich our thinking and our work. We were able to benefit from advice in areas such as law, data access, information sharing, governance, and accountability. It's important to note that the work of our Transition Committee was carried out in the continuity with the work of the first Provisional Council and aligned with the work of the TRC. Today, we are reaching an important milestone in our mandate. 4 years after the Interim Council's final report and almost 8 years after the TRC's final report and 94 calls to action. This is a pivotal moment. One might even dare to say that this is the historic part of the long journey leading to the creation of the National Reconciliation Council. Throughout our work in co-developing the legislative framework for the Council, we have made a point of keeping those who do not necessarily occupy the chairs around the large tables and forums for discussion of reconciliation at the heart of our process. As far as I'm concerned, my daily work at the Val d'Or Indigenous Friendship Center is to be at the side of those for whom reconciliation must make sense. My experience of over 30 years as executive director has allowed me to live in proximity and in relationship with the members of my community. By working closely with people on a daily basis, I get to know their stories, the stories of their families, to understand their experiences, their struggles, their failures, and their successes. By being on the ground, I don't really want to interrupt you, but we want to allow for many questions. It's supposed to be 5 minutes, so if you could wrap up, please. So I will wrap up by saying that a National Reconciliation Council must reflect real life and must not be disconnected from what makes reconciliation truly meaningful to our people. Thank you. Miigwech. Thank you, Mrs. Cloutier. Before going to the next person, did you agree on an order for testimony, or might I choose myself the next person? Microphone. It would be up to Mr. Case, then Rosemary, and we would conclude with Mike. That's great.
Mr. Mitch Case, you have 5 minutes to make your opening statement. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to all the members of the committee here today for inviting my colleagues and I to come and present to you some of our thoughts on the work that we've been undertaking together for a year, and a few of our colleagues for much longer than that. I think I just want to set the context for this discussion in what is proposed in the bill related to the role and the mandate of the National Council for Reconciliation. Right, in that section, it outlines that the National Council for Reconciliation is to establish a broad, flexible definition of reconciliation, reflective of the changing needs of Indigenous communities, and the incredibly complex task that is before this country if reconciliation is going to be is actually going to be achieved. That means reconciliation on social issues, reconciliation on rights issues, reconciliation on economic issues, and everything else beyond that. We're also very clear in that legislation, and at least in the proposed legislation, that we're establishing the National Council for Reconciliation not to do reconciliation. It is not set up so that reconciliation will now be accomplished because this council is established. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in their calls to action, were incredibly clear that this is an all of Canadian society issue. It is all of society. It is all levels of government, all levels of Canadian society that have to be a part of this conversation. And so the goal and the way that we have written our recommendations that went into the legislation is to establish a National Council to be the body that watches, that keeps an eye on, that makes sure that where things are falling behind, they are pointed out, but also equally importantly, where things are working and where progress is being made, that is highlighted and celebrated and championed. And so those calls to action, not the calls to action, sorry, but the proposed mandate and reason for being of the National Council for Reconciliation, I think we have to keep our eye on. I think sometimes we're in our honest and true desire to see change in this country, we try to add too many things all at once. And at least our proposal for what this should look like is that this is the body that is mandated to observe, watch, recommend, guide, advise, caution, chastise, all of those things. But it's not like the rest of Canada now sits back and all governments sit back and say, oh, the National Council will reconcile everything. They'll take care of that work, right? We, certainly believe that we've given a very clear path forward for that, a very clear and as simple as possible of a process for something that is incredibly unsimple and incredibly complex. One of the things that we certainly I want to caution is again that we don't try to add too many things to that. I've been watching some of the other testimony that has come before the committee, and I think there are some incredibly helpful thoughts there for once the council is established, right? For going into what is listed as the first action for that council to do is to establish the National Action Plan, and all of those things should go into that. And I'm getting my 4-minute warning, so I know, Mr. Chair, I've got about maybe a minute or 30 seconds left. I just want to sort of conclude by saying that assuming that this legislation goes forward, and assuming that the National Council is established, it is long overdue. We know, we've heard from everyone that this was supposed to happen 6, 7, 8 years ago. It hasn't happened yet. We're hoping that it will happen now. But the caution is that then that doesn't mean we take our eye off the work that is ahead of us, right? Because now this body will be watching to see if we actually do anything. So I think, Mr. Chair, I'll leave it there. And that's never happened that I've been done before the time I was allotted. So I will end there.
Well, thank you, Mr. Case. Congratulations. And
Merci, Monsieur.
Miss Rosemary Cooper for the next 5 minutes.
Kaya na may it's about katemajinlo ama ilisaki ko malawang wak sa Lori ilaw MP wood nunavumi tusa hatang miga kino titok tukulo tilutin inutito ko makaw miga matamanin na kani ta kwaro katimahatik ka kujali galawa kibaka at so sudatat sa mga katimahatalaw at maligaw lang ayo may kano akit sa mga Pimmakilaw migatiko takwa Canada miutaw yun katimajiw
Point
niya
of order,
tuwi.
Mr. Chairman. There's no translation.
I'm sorry, Ms. Cooper. We'll just hold it for a second while we check on translation.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I was not told that I was not made aware that Ms. Cooper needed interpretation, and the Inuktitut interpreter is late. She went to the wrong building because we've had a room change this morning.
Understood. So perhaps, if it's all right, we'll gain an extra 5 minutes if Mr. Michael Degagne speaks, and then hopefully, Ms. Cooper, you will be able to start over with your 5-minute statement. Mr. Degagne, are you ready to speak at this point? We'll give you 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I appreciate the opportunity today to both present a few ideas and answer questions with respect to this bill. I only have a few points to make. First of all, I think following from what Mitch was saying earlier, reconciliation is not something that we derive just from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think it's safe to say we've been actively engaged with some form of reconciliation in this country for 50 years, going back to maybe the Hawthorne Report of 1964, the policy work done by the National Indian Brotherhood, and a variety of different parliamentary committees, certainly the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1995, and more lately the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is not a new idea, and it's not a new process, but it has not, to this point, had a structure. Most of the time when we establish a program or a project that is to help Indigenous people, it doesn't come with a structure. They're programs and projects that are time limited. Their investments are made, objectives are set, but they often sunset quickly, and there's no lasting legacy for a structure that drives this forward. This is not the way it is with the rest of Canadian society. And you will find then, for that reason, that there's very little in the way of civil society that of Indigenous-specific civil society in Canada. So structures are critically important. I think we should also note that reconciliation is not a political process. Certainly, it involves politics, but it is not solely a political process. And so it's a way to engage both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians in a dialogue around going forward in a good way. And I think the final thing I'd like to say is that there is a sense that this organization, this structure, would be established for the purpose of perhaps an audit function, whether that's for government or whatever else is happening with respect to reconciliation more broadly in Canadian society. We're not auditors. We are champions. We are people who are looking to find organizations, entities, individuals, corporations, and there are lots of them that are doing excellent work in reconciliation, and to point out what is going well and why it's going well so that all of us can benefit from that. So those are the points I'd like to make. I'll close with saying that the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which I was a part of, was established in 1998, and there are great similarities between this establishment and the establishment of the foundation some 20-odd years ago. It should be noted that most of the heavy lifting, most of the engagement with Canadians and Indigenous communities was done after the organization was established. So we are asking here today for the establishment of a solid establishment of an organization that has staying power, that will last and allow us to do reconciliation and to honor reconciliation into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Degagne. So we have to make a decision at this point. If the Inuktitut interpreter is not here, We have one of two choices. We can start with questions. Please, somebody has something to say? No, okay. We can either start with questions now, and when the interpreter comes, we'll put 5 minutes in place. I see Ms. Cooper has her hand up.
I can speak English.
We do apologize for
No.
this. It was one of those things where a room change occurred at the last minute and the message didn't get out, but very much appreciate this, Ms. Cooper. So if you are ready, we will start the clock for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, and I won't take the whole 5 minutes. I'm being mindful of the time. So I'd like to just thank the chair and the committee members for welcoming us here today and acknowledge MP Lori Laut from my jurisdiction in Nunavut. And really pleased to be with the transitional committee members here. We've worked quite extensively since we were established, and what was critical for us as a transitional committee was the composition of the members of the board that was forthcoming to ensure that we had men, Canadian, gender diverse people, and just a mix, but not political in nature, was very important for us in how this board will be functioning. So I just want to leave it there and keep in time with the time that you have here today.
Thank you very much, Miss Cooper. I will now pass it over for questions, and we'll start with 6-minute rounds, and the first speaker will be Mr. Vidal. Mr. Vidal, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of you for not only for just being here today, but for the work you've done over the last, well, some of you over the last year, as Mr. Case said, and some of you for several years being part of both the interim board and now the transitional committee. Some really good conversation today around a number of items. I'm trying to get to a couple of those things in my brief 6 minutes here. First of all, when I kind of read through this draft legislation, in Section 3, it talks about the sending in of the articles. I mean, it's the process of creating the entity, right? And your committee is very responsible for that, if I interpret the legislation right, where one of you, on behalf of the group, will be responsible to file the articles of incorporation. My understanding from my accounting background is in that filing of articles of incorporation, there's going to be a requirement to define membership and define some processes through the structure that's created. And nowhere in all of our conversations so far, I've been able to determine or find what the intent of the membership of this nonprofit corporation will look like. Are you aware of kind of what you're going to proceed with in the context of the articles of incorporation, in the context of membership for this nonprofit entity?
Having been elected to respond.
I saw that.
Yeah. The transitional committee has agreed to be a part of the establishment of a permanent board, one that's ongoing. Our focus will not be on political representation from a variety of different political organizations, or even representation from the broad range of stakeholders that are involved with reconciliation in Canada. At least we won't as a snapshot.
I'm so limited in time. I don't mean to be rude, but I'm going to get to the board composition
Okay,
and your role.
all right.
I'm talking the actual membership of the entity. Most nonprofit corporations, you define a membership, and if you follow through on the legislation down the road, it is that membership that ultimately elects the future board of directors based on a process. So I'm talking specifically of the membership of the organization itself, not the board of directors, if you don't mind, just for clarity.
Yeah, I don't know that that the organization as it moves forward will be a member organization. I mean, I think at first the members will be the directors, and we'll establish it in that way. But we're not looking for an organization that has, like, for example, a hospital board, a broad range of people
So
who are members.
you're suggesting that the board of directors, the established board of directors going forward, will ultimately also be the membership. That will be defined as the membership. Is that what I'm hearing?
Initially, yes, and as with most nonprofits, I would say.
No, sorry. Most nonprofits actually have a membership that elects a board of directors.
Yeah, that's right.
They're not necessarily the same group, right?
They may not necessarily be the same group, but they can be the same
They can be. But the way this is defined, it could go either way. So you've provided the clarity for me that
Okay.
it would be your intent that it's the board of directors that ultimately is the membership.
Initially, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's fair. In the context of now, let's move on to the board of directors as you started, which now we've identified as maybe the same group of people, so that's fair. In the legislation, there's a provision that talks about this beginning the 5th year after the day of incorporation and whatever, that we will have this broad definition of people on the board of directors. There's an application process from the first board. Can you identify for me why there's a 5-year delay on that requirement? Why would we not just do that right up front?
Well, I think initially, if we envision this organization as having a longer arc than just a few years, we would want to be able to get established. It would give us, I think, give the organization an opportunity to engage with stakeholders, and the stakeholders will have something to say about who they'd like to see on that board.
But in all fairness, sir, the process, this first board of directors is ultimately selected by the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. I get in collaboration. I get that language. Yeah. I would rather see that language be a little stronger to say jointly, or where you folks have more say, to be honest with you. But because ultimately he still has the final say in the process. And then that board of directors ultimately sets the process for the selection and election of future board by themselves, is what you just told me, because the membership is the actual board of directors. So there's a bit of a process here where this is self-perpetuating. And then after 5 years, now we're required to have this broad base of representation, being women and youth and gender and all these other groups. Why not right away? Why not right up front? Why do we not remove that and have that requirement to elect the first board or select the first board with that broad base of representation from across the country, different regions, different spaces in our society, so to speak? Why in 5 years?
I think what we're used to doing is looking at this sort of representation type of boards, and let's face it, this is the way we're being driven in Canadian society generally around boards. When we look at these things as a snapshot, so that every group has to be represented at the same time on the first day. The problem there is that there are so many different stakeholders in reconciliation, and so you would have a vastly larger board than the one we have now. So what we're saying is look, be patient. There will be representatives from a broad cross-section of Canadian society at the beginning, but it's going to be over an arc of time. So over 10 years, let's say.
Sorry, I'm really almost out of time. You're saying, we're saying there will be.
Yes.
But sorry, in essence, you're saying for the rest of Canadians, say, trust the minister because he's going to select the board.
No.
Ultimately, we've agreed to that.
No, we're
that ultimately the
board.
minister has the say.
Yeah.
He's going to say select this first board, and now you're telling me it will be a broad base, but that's not required till 5 years from now. So what's the assurance that will be the case?
You're trusting the board, essentially, right? You're trusting the board.
No, I'm trusting the minister to select the board.
with us, with our consultation, right?
Right. But we just agreed that he ultimately has the final say.
I think what we're looking at is saying that we cannot establish a broad-based board on the first day. And that if we look over the course of time, you will find that eventually everybody and every stakeholder will have a seat at that table.
Thank you. I think the chair is going to stop me there.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. We'll now go to Mr. Baptiste for 6 minutes.
I just would like to start off by thanking you for the work that you've done over the last few years to getting to where we are today, and looking at your descriptions of the membership we have on the transition committee. We have people from the friendship centers. We have people from the Métis Nation. We have people representing the North. We're hearing the English, the Indigenous languages. We're hearing the French as well. And it's important to have that kind of diversity, looking at a committee that's taking on this role. My first question is going to be about the relationship now with the minister. And would you say that you've had a good working relationship with the minister? You know, some people have tried to frame this as paternal, as the minister is doing this big oversight. Can you give us a little bit of a description how the working relationship has been over the past few years with the minister?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. I'll just respond very briefly, and then others can jump in. But I think that this process, in the work that we've done, I think we only I think we only saw the minister, I think, once, and then we were left to do our work, and we were certainly supported by his office, and coordinating things and all of the work that needed to happen, and the staff behind the scenes were incredibly helpful.
So you'd say very supportive and hands-off, allowed the committee to do the important work that was necessary.
That's my view of things, and certainly others can contradict me if they want to.
Okay. I guess the other part, if that's kind of the general, what the transition committee is, their thoughts are. But I'm looking at the 126.5 million, as well as a 1.5 million for the starting year. Does that give the committee? Do you feel that that's an amount that gives the committee a long range to conduct the work of reconciliation? Because reconciliation is not going to be done in a year. It may take a generation. Does the 120? Can you tell us a little bit about what you foresee that money and how you see that? Is that an adequate amount of money for the reconciliation over a number of years?
I think it's clear amongst this group that it will not be an adequate amount of money over the course of time. But it is, I think, initially sufficient to get the organization going and to get doing its work. It also puts some pressure on the organization in, let's say, 5 years to demonstrate some results and demonstrate that that the reconciliation movement is being pushed forward by this organization. So I think it accomplishes enough to get us initially started. It is not by any stretch of the imagination the kind of the first commitment that will last forever. Certainly not with all the First Nations, Métis interests and non-Indigenous interests in Canada. So I think it's enough to get us going, and it will put pressure on us to demonstrate results.
Okay. And so within the makeup of the committee, the recommendation is to have one seat from the MNC, one seat from AFN, and one seat from the ITK. Can you give us a little bit of explanation as to how you came upon those three groups and those numbers in terms of the makeup of the committee?
Merci de la question.
Thank you for this question. It's very important to get a plurality of votes that composes the Indigenous peoples, the plurality of voices, and to have a council that allows us to work and to go forward. A large council can be heavier with regards to an administrative burden, so a representation from the Assembly of First Nations, the Inuit representation, and Métis representation makes it so that from the basis we do have representation of Indigenous peoples. Now, it's through calls to nominations, we have to obtain this plurality of voices. You mentioned this early on in your comments. Women, LGBT, people who live in urban and rural settings, older people, younger people, and I think that we have the opportunity to open up to different types of people who want to be involved within the council.
The last question I have is, part of the calls to action, a lot of them are federal jurisdiction. Some of them, like health and education, are provincial jurisdiction. Some of them are calling on law schools or universities. How do we envision this council being able to affect change with all the stakeholders? As you said, Magdaganya, there's so many stakeholders involved in reconciliation. It's not just the federal government. How do we feel that a federal national committee could help sway or push provinces or universities to do more on the calls to action?
Well, I guess just speaking as an example of the university perspective, having worked in that sector and spoken to some universities, generally get the same questions. How can we better reach the Indigenous community in our school, and how can we begin the process of reconciliation with not just inside the school but with our community? And what they're largely unaware of, although there are efforts in this regard, is what everyone else is doing. And I think that's going to be a big part of what this reconciliation organization will do, is to say, you don't have to recreate everything from scratch every time. There are corporate initiatives that are exemplary, and other corporations can emulate them. There are university initiatives that are exemplary, and other universities can emulate them. So I think there's going to be a lot of that, is that just sharing information, getting into the data, and making sure also that where commitments are made around reconciliation, that we make sure people honor them.
Can I add to that very briefly, Mr. Chair?
Please go ahead.
I think it also, to that question, it also comes down to that first point in the mandate, is to establish that broad definition of reconciliation, because with respect to your question, you only mentioned the TRC calls to action, right? But RCAP had hundreds of recommendations as well. The courts have outlined reconciliation in a legal framework, right? Reconciliation means a lot of different things, and so I think to Mike's point, the council can have that role of convening these conversations and helping organizations, entities, schools, whatever it be, that want to do something and don't know where to start, right? It can be that convener to pull TRC, RCAP, everything else, MMIWG, all of those things into one place to help convene those conversations.
And if I can supplement very briefly, Chair, I mean, this is also tied into education, a broader Canadian education. How do we reconcile? What are the promising practices? Those are essential to the board in the work that they'll be working on. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Thank you, Monsieur Baptiste. Nous irons maintenant à Madame Gill pour 6 minutes.
Now, Mrs. Gill, for 6 minutes. Thank you. And thank you to all the witnesses for their presentations today. I would have several questions, and I know that time is at a premium. So, we were talking about the 5th anniversary. I didn't hear a complete answer. I was also wondering why it is that it took so much time to be able to create a council that would be representative, of course, of Indigenous peoples or of the Indigenous reality. I'm not sure who is able to answer. I don't want to designate one single person. If you'll allow me, Mrs. Gill, thank you for your question. We mentioned this earlier. The Transition Committee will be part of the first permanent Council for Reconciliation. You do have an example of this diverse representation with us four, but we will not create the entire board, of course. Obviously, there will be 3 representatives for the national institutions that will join the board, and there is a call for nominations. And through this call for nominations, the board will be created. And this does have to happen jointly with the minister, of course. The minister cannot make decisions alone. And so through this work, we have to incorporate a lot of work. We have a lot of work before us. In the next year, we have to establish a corporation. We have to manage all of this. But we believe that in 5 years, or perhaps even in 3 or 2, that this diverse board will be completed. This being said, and I'll end on this point, the legislation was drafted in order to allow the power to the board so that it is able to set out its own action plan to work on constituting a board that is representative of the diversity of our Indigenous peoples in Canada. So it will require some time. I'm asking this question because 5 years, in my opinion, it seems like a very long period of time to attain representation. And I believe that the temporary board had already consulted with some organizations, as well as yourselves. So, and even the commission, when we speak of the commission itself, we spoke with many stakeholders. So I can imagine that there's already quite good knowledge of the reality. I understand the challenges that you are facing, Of course, you want a very a board that is representing people. Talked about the three national representatives and that this represented the larger groups. I'm not sure if everyone would agree with the statement that that represents most Indigenous people, but do you believe that it's going to take 5 years? And don't you think it would be possible to do this work in a shorter time frame? It might be possible. We put 5 years as a timeline, but of course we will do our very best to constitute a board that is representative of the reality of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I understand you talked about bylaws and such, and I understand that this has to be drafted, or the statutes rather, and it can't be too complicated either, as you were saying. If you have a lot of bureaucratic wait, it will take a lot of time. Now, as to Section 12B, I was wondering once again, we were talking about representation, and we're talking about the First Nations and Inuit nations, and then the other Indigenous peoples in Canada. What does this mean exactly? I don't know if someone has an answer to this. It's Canadian representation of non-Indigenous persons. We know that reconciliation is built not just between Indigenous peoples, but it does require working with the entire Canadian population in order to move forward. So why is peoples in a plural form? It's really in plural in French. If you don't have the answer, it's okay. We can obtain it later. I was also wondering why this was plural. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Gill. Now, Mrs. Eadloud, 6 minutes. Mrs. Eadloud.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chair, but there's no Inuktitut translation this morning, unfortunately.
Rosemary, I'll translate for myself what I just said in Inuktitut. First of all, welcome to all of you. I really appreciate what you've shared with us today. Your testimony is very important to the study, and I know that Bill C-29 is going to be a momentous moment when we do finally have it passed in the House, and the guiding work that this council will bring forward, I think, will give a lot of hope to Indigenous peoples for generations. I had also mentioned in Inuktitut that I normally speak in Inuktitut, but today, because of our lack of translation, you have the unique honor of hearing me directly in English. And I also thanked Rosemary for speaking in Inuktitut. I love our language, and it's wonderful to hear it from other people. I wanted to very briefly ask a question about the work that you did in preparation for Bill C-29, and whether there had been discussions about whether Indigenous rights should also be monitored and reported upon.
Do you want to respond to that?
I can start. Thank you for that question, and I think that's where that very first bullet point there about establishing a broad definition of reconciliation, because there's reconciliation in terms of what we think of in our popular imagination of that, stemming from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is more about relationships and those things. But the Supreme Court was talking about reconciliation 20 years before the TRC, and that was about reconciling Indigenous law and and Canadian law as expressed through institutions like this. And so I think that broad definition, when the council gets to that point of establishing that broad definition, it has to take into account the legal reconciliation, which is the rights protection piece that I know matters to you. I've been watching the committee and matters to me. That's what I do when I'm not hanging out with these guys, right? So, I understand where that question comes from, and I think it's addressed by that broad definition. Economic reconciliation. What does that mean? What does reconciliation in terms of the residential school question? Because that's only one piece of it, right? The theft of land and all those other things are huge issues that were facilitated and made possible by residential schools, but are another separate issue, right? And so I think it's, when it says develop a broad definition, I actually think they're talking about developing a dozen definitions of economic reconciliation, land-based reconciliation, culture-based reconciliation, all of those different things. So I think that gets to the question.
Thank you very much. I am glad to hear that there had been discussions about ensuring that Indigenous rights are protected, because I think as we all know, we are frequently deprived of our rights. Frequently we experience the violation of our Indigenous rights. So I'm glad to hear that there has been that discussion, and that there was at least some effort to make sure that in the preamble that we do have this council be guided by UNDRIP, but I think that one of the amendments that I'll be suggesting is to make sure that it's also in the legislation, so that there is a signal to the council that promoting and protecting Indigenous people's rights must be a form of the work that the council does, in addition to monitoring and reporting on policies and programs. I do have a couple of quick questions. These are more for guidance for legal drafters, because a couple of gaps that exist in the bill are the lack of definitions for elders and the lack of definition for survivors. But I think we're going to need to get a better sense of how to ensure that we're reflecting important Indigenous people's views, especially when it comes to identifying who elders might be, and how to make sure that we're identifying survivors that need to be heard by this council. So I wonder if you can provide some guidance to what will be the legislative drafters about what would be considered for elders and what would be considered for survivors. Kuya Nami.
I think certainly I've dealt with this question in the past in the establishment of other organizations, and there is a desire for there to be for these organizations to establish who is how is an elder defined, how is a survivor defined, and these sorts of things. But where we wound up was that it's best to have communities define these terms, and so you are an elder if you're identified and defined by your own community as an elder. So it would not be for this organization to establish for all sorts of cultural groups who their elders and who the survivors are, and so I wouldn't anticipate that there would be an attempt in the legislation to try and define that in advance. It may come out more in engagement later on down the line.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. We'll now proceed with the second round of questions, and we'll start for 5 minutes. Mr. Schmale.
Thank you very much, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I do appreciate your testimony. I will open the floor to this question, and I do have a very small amount of time, so I would like to get your thoughts on the Prime Minister not being named in this legislation to respond to the progress of the government on an annual basis. Is that something that you're okay with at this point, with the minister doing it rather than the Prime Minister?
Ce que je peux préciser, c'est que dans le premier rapport,
what I can say is that in the first report that was tabled by Provisory Committee in 2018, we had made the recommendation that the Prime Minister should be responsible for submitting the report to the Parliament, and then we reiterated in our recommendations throughout the Transition Committee that this should be the case. Now, modifications were made, but we are still of the opinion, aligned with what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had recommended, that it be the Prime Minister that have the mandate to presenting this in the House of Commons.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to talk to you about measurable targets. A lot of I'm getting severe feedback in my headset. I don't know if anyone else is.
I think we're okay now. Whoever has their microphone unmuted, please mute them. Go ahead, Mr. Schmale.
Okay, perfect. I think Mr. McLeod had the same issue. Where was I? In terms of the measurables, a lot of the legislation, it focuses around efforts to get things done, efforts to do this. Should we be looking at some stronger wording in this legislation in order to ensure that proper benchmarks are there and it's not just efforts, it's actually getting things done and hitting those targets?
Well, efforts is probably as far as you can take this particular. I don't know that reconciliation is the type of thing where you can have clear and measurable outcomes. You know that when reconciliation is being adopted by more organizations, whether or not it's become a part of the social discourse, whether or not corporations, individuals, governments are developing plans and these sorts of things. So I think you'll have a lot of proxy measures based on what other activities people are taking. But the idea, for example, move from efforts at reconciliations to, and I think it was mentioned before, to ensure reconciliation. Ensuring is very, very difficult. You'd have to have an organization that has the teeth to police it and to make sure that commitments are put in place. So I don't think you can get much farther than efforts can be made around achieving reconciliation.
I'm getting massive feedback again.
So, Mr. De Gagné, if your microphone is unmuted, please mute it.
Okay, I think we're gone. Hopefully, I didn't damage anyone's hearing with that. When you're in terms of the measurables, in terms of just using efforts, would you be concerned that it's not giving the government the full incentive to get this done? We've seen in a number of reports, we've seen departmental plans, we've seen shortfalls in even the department meeting its set targets. If we're just using the language of efforts, then my fear is it just becomes a repeat of history where we just keep pushing the line down the road, right? We'll get to it. We're hitting targets, we're making the best effort, but we're not actually achieving anything.
No, I think it's fair to have organizations and individuals and all of our engagements directed towards defining what a reconciled Canada would look like. And I think that will take a long time. And I think we have to have some sense of, not when we're done reconciling, but what a reconciled Canada would look like. And so I think it's fair to define that. Measurable targets, aside from maybe financial targets, and investments in reconciliation, I think those would be reasonable to put in place. But otherwise, I think it's going to be plans, objectives in those plans, and how individuals and organizations and governments are achieving those objectives. So measurables, I don't think are lend themselves easily to reconciliation.
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. We'll go to Mr. Weiler for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Thank you for being here today and for all your hard work. on the Transition Committee.
My first question relates to something Madame Cloutier mentioned earlier. You said that the Transitional Committee heard from experts from all different walks of life, including on law, data access, and information sharing. And I think a really critical point of this legislation is ensuring that the committee, or the council rather, will have access to the information that will allow them to do their work. And I'm curious, I hope you could tell the committee what you heard from those experts on data and information sharing, and if you're confident with the way that the legislation is written right now, that will ensure that the committee, or the council rather, will have access to the information that it'll need to effectively carry out its mandate.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite. Could you just give me a quick précis of that, and I'll.
Sure. So
I'm sorry about wasting my time, but
yeah, no, that's quite all right. So Section 16 talks about a protocol being developed by the minister in consultation or in collaboration with the council. And so my question to the witnesses here is: are you confident that that is language that will ensure that the protocol that is developed will be sufficient to give the council the information that it needs to do its work?
I don't think any of these sort of requests for information are seamless, but I think it's positive in that we set out right from the outset that we want to work with those people who are providing the information so that it can be used in a form that is understandable to Canadians and other people that this organization would report to. So I mean, this is a harvesting operation, right? I mean, all departments are doing reconciliation in some form or another. All of that stuff will be brought to the center. There has to be some efforts on the other end to make sure that it's all something that we can digest and share with others. So I think this is enough. I mean, obviously this is negotiated and discussed in some length, but I think this is a good place to start.
And just very briefly, I think I think this goes about as far as we can expect it to, and it's actually not the necessarily the federal government I'm concerned about, the data sharing agreement. It's Call to Action 55 lists some of the proposed types of data that would go into the National Council doing its assessment. I think it's 55, Call to Action 55. And when you look at that, a lot of that, because of Canada's constitutional framework, a lot of that is provincial jurisdiction. My concern is more that we won't get, or they won't get, information from the provinces on key indicators of whether or not we're actually moving things forward. I'm less concerned about the federal government, but there's no ability or no power here, at least unless someone's got a new section of the Canadian Constitution I don't know about, where you could do that and mandate the provinces to hand over that information. So it's going to be very much based on goodwill with other levels of government outside the federal government.
Peut-être un commentaire très rapide.
A quick comment. There are other groups working on data and information collection. I'm thinking of working groups, and Rosemary is part of one, on the issue of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I believe that there will be mechanisms in place at different levels for sharing and collecting of information, and this could be part of these protocols.
Much for that. Maybe just last question here, because I know my time's running out. A key part of reconciliation is working with Indigenous groups on self-determination and advancing that right across the country, and with over I think 634 different nations or Indigenous groups across the country, it is a major challenge that all have different governance systems. And so I'm wondering what role do the witnesses see for the council in helping to advance some of the discussions on this, on both treaty negotiation for some nations where there still are no treaties, many of which they're in my province, as well as treaty implementation across the country?
Well, it's similar to Madame Idlaut's comments. I think there's an interest in rights, making sure that rights are considered. There's an interest in making sure that UNDRIP is considered, and in treaties are considered, land is considered. I think all of those things are parallel processes with reconciliation. And I don't know that, I think this is an organization and this structure wants to push forward on reconciliation so that somebody can't say, you know what, until all rights are recognized in this country, we just can't move forward. Or until all the land questions are settled, we just can't move forward. I think there's a structure gives an imperative to move forward in reconciliation where it's occurring, but not to ignore those other very critical questions.
I guess I'd just like to add as well, I mean, in reconciliation efforts, self-determination or distinctions-based Indigenous lands is critical in Canada, but as well as gender-based analysis that the federal government has committed to is equally important while we make efforts to ensure that the diverse people that are challenged, whether it's gender diverse people, youth, you know, the whole sector that we're trying to engage with in the effort to recognize Inuit, First Nations, Métis in Canada and their rights. I think we're at a milestone in Canada with some leverage going on for self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. Nous irons maintenant à Madame Gill pour 2 minutes et demie.
Now, Mrs. Gill, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. To conclude, I'd like to come back to 12B. Perhaps it's not possible to answer the question here today, but if you could send a written answer as to the interpretation of 12B, it would be interesting because here it would be preferable for us to do things correctly, to truly understand the interpretation of 12B. I wanted to ask a question with regards, well, I would like to talk about senior and survivors, but I know that my colleague, Mrs. Idlout, spoke about this. Also, with regards to the primacy of the Act on page 3 of the French version of the document, right after the definitions, it is said, for me, in the committee here, I'm not exactly sure what it's referring to, this section after the definitions. Why is there this section, and what does it mean more concretely? If you have an example so that I'm able to better understand. Thank you.
I think, Madame, that's sorry. That's the legal process. Is that that part of the work of that this transitional committee has agreed to do is once the legislation winds its way through here, that this committee will take on the task of actually establishing legally under the organization itself. So someone has to just file the documents. I don't think there's anything more to that than sort of a mechanical effort.
C'est constitutif.
Yeah.
C'est tout simplement constitutif. Merci.
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to know. So with my last 10 seconds, maybe it's because it's the Bloc Québécois or we're defending the French language, but I was surprised at the last meeting of the committee, 2 stakeholders from the Innu community said that they felt that they were sometimes quite far, even that their Innu language is not the same in all communities, and French is their second language, and they were wondering if there was a representation, because we're talking about different regions, urban, rural, isolated settings, and they were wondering if the French aspect, even though Innu is their first language, if the French language is something that could be represented within the board, given that French is their second language. A quick answer, please, because Mrs. Gill has gone over her 10 seconds.
Gill, pour avoir...
Yes, I was part of this committee. I've been part of the committee since 2017, and I live in Quebec myself, and I speak 2 languages. And I confirm that this is a priority. It's always been a priority, and we will make it a priority as well to make sure that official languages are well represented.
Cool. Ms. Idlout, we'll go to you now for 2.5 minutes.
I think it's been pretty obvious in my year that Indigenous languages are very important to me. I've introduced a bill to make amendments to the Elections Act so that Indigenous language speakers can access elections materials in their languages. And I think that this council will need to also be able to hear from Indigenous peoples in their languages. Do you think that it will be important that whatever the Indigenous language is, the Parliament will need to be able to provide the Council the resources it needs, regardless of how many Indigenous languages there are or Indigenous language speakers there are remaining in that language, that resources are provided so that whatever that Indigenous language speaker is heard in their language that they wish to be heard in.
In a previous organization, I worked with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. After we were established and had operated for a few years, we conducted 36 regional consultations from north to south and east to west. And it was surprising to us that we were speaking about an organization that dealt with Indigenous residential schools and boarding schools. And it was surprising to us that the number one issue that most people had in terms of loss in those institutions was their language. And it was surprised because we were not set up to a deal with language. And so there were questions raised about how we could at least, even though we were not a language organization, but do our part in terms of making sure that there was to support Indigenous languages. And we did so mainly with 6 language groups, and to the extent we could, and just in terms of print publications and that sort of thing. And I would not see the kinds of resources present in this organization to make it into a language institution, but I would certainly see it critical to ensure that we do what we can to support Indigenous languages in print translation and making our materials available in languages for children and things like that. So I think efforts can be made. Whether or not it's going to be comprehensive enough, I don't think so, but certainly efforts can be made when the organization is established to honor as many Indigenous languages as we can.
And if I may supplement,
Oh, I'm sorry.
If I may supplement to that point, I may think it's a relevant point, though, that you raised here, MP Loud, because there's not only the language of communication, the format of communication is also critical. I just came from Mijarut yesterday, and the connectivity was just really slow compared to main Canada, and using the different platforms of way of communicating will also be critical in the formats that will be going forward. I just want to add to that as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Idlout. We'll now go to Mr. Zimmer. That's who I have on my list here for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be passing my time to Mr. Vidal. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to qualify a little bit in my first round. If I appear to come off a little bit aggressive, that's not my purpose. I serve a riding that represents the second highest population and the third highest population of Indigenous people in the country by actual numbers and by percentage. And so I can sometimes get a little bit passionate in my desire to actually make improvements to something that I feel is lacking and could be made better. So that's my purpose here, okay? When I sit at this table. I want to follow up a little bit on the efforts conversation again with Mr. Degagné. on the public record, one of your colleagues, both on the transitional committee and on the interim board of directors, Mr. Littlechild, or Chief Littlechild, I should be more correct. He talked about the word efforts needing deletion, and that it should say, not efforts for, but just simply advancing reconciliation, because that would be more appropriate. We're on this journey, and we should be seeking to advance, not just. Do you disagree with him then in your comment about efforts is good? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to pitch you again. That's not my point. But I think we're to a place where we really need to seek to advance reconciliation, not just seem to be or be seen to be making efforts. That's where I'm coming from. Okay.
Yeah, and I think, and I appreciate that, because I mean, this is that whenever you see the phrase "best efforts," it's a kind of letting you off the hook. And we want to keep the momentum going, and I think Wilton Littlechild's comments about advancing reconciliation are spot on. I wouldn't want to see something like uphold reconciliation or ensure reconciliation. I mean, I don't think we'd want to see that in any other with any other issue in Canada where suddenly we had unlimited resources to make sure, to absolutely be certain that this happened. But certainly, we want to make sure that that we advance things, that the momentum that we have so far is behind us, that can carry forward. So I'm in agreement with that kind of language.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just wanted to bring a little clarity to that and kind of to set my framework a little bit clearer that if I didn't before. I'm going to come to you the question, Mr. And then you can add to both if you want. You talked about call to action 55 being kind of provincial. I just quickly went and looked at it because I want to refresh my memory, but out of 7 points in call to action 55, I believe 5 of them have a pretty significant federal component. In the legislation, we see a brief mention of call to action 55 in the preamble, but nothing in the purpose and function section. And my colleague, Mr. Schmale, was trying to talk about measurables. I mean, some of my language around this has been call to action 55 has some very, very clear and identifiable measures that we can quantify and we can measure our success. And there's this old adage that says, hey, what gets measured gets done. And I would like to see some language that actually includes those items in call to action 55, but language not limited to just those. There's many more that we could measure. Would you agree that that is important that we still measure some of the very quantifiable things to see if we're achieving success on that journey to reconciliation?
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree that what gets measured gets done, but I would take issue with your analysis of the list in call to action 55. Those are federal jurisdiction where they apply to on reserve questions, but there are still multiple issues where Métis communities are still left out of that, despite being how many years since the Daniels decision. So we're still trapped under provincial jurisdiction in the places where Métis communities exist, right? So those, if you're only going to look at the federal component where there is a longstanding legacy of the federal government actually taking its responsibility for these issues seriously, then that will immediately start to leave out Métis communities. So
I guess I would qualify that with, and I think I made that very clear, that there is some very measurable items there that, yes, they do apply to federal jurisdiction on First Nations. But I also opened the door to say, hey, there's some other things that we could do to very clearly measure success as well. So I think we're saying the same thing at the end of the day.
The only caution I would add is, the more you strengthen what you're asking of the National Council, then you should strengthen its budget also.
Fair enough. And I'm running out of time. I'm going to ask one more quick question. A number of you have made comments about economic reconciliation, and it's something we've heard a lot at this table if you've been following, I'm sure. And my one quick question is, would you agree that in section 12, I believe, when we talk about representation being this varied group, would you agree that there might be a room to add somebody that brings to the table the concept of achieving economic reconciliation as well?
I think that would certainly be contemplated. I mean, there's all sorts of different sectors where reconciliation is possible. So, I mean, I don't know that it's essential to list that, economic reconciliation as if to say, here, this is, a special one. But it's certainly critical to reconciliation, just as, rights and all of these other elements are. So I don't see it as having to be intentionally included. I would see it, as I read it, that it's already there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. We'll now go to Ms. Atwin for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. It's been particularly helpful, I think, for our committee's work. I'd like to go back to something that Ms. Cloutier mentioned, specifically with her experience with friendship centers and kind of the lived experience of the people who we want to be most impacted by this legislation. And so I'm just wondering, you know, again, for reconciliation to be meaningful, it needs to have that positive impact on community, on reserve, off reserve, urban, rural. So we need to know if the steps we're taking are making a difference. So I'm just wondering how we do that. So do you have any thoughts for how the board can best report on this, especially for, say, remote communities?
Dans notre travail pour... is it working? Yes.
Our work and what we've learned throughout our work is that it's necessary and important to have a council for reconciliation that has a certain scope and that concentrates specifically on reconciliation. How can we measure success? Well, we don't want to have defined this too strictly in the legislation because it's important to give to the Council the powers to meet its own commitments, to set out its action plan, and to develop organically or to evolve organically as an organization, independent organization. So they have to have enough space to not be disconnected from our reality and from people's lives, but really to have a strong connection and to have this ability to act.
If I might just add a point, just as an example, you know, when I started in this particular industry, you know, 40 years ago, I would have said, wouldn't it be great if we could open every meeting or, you know, whether you're a corporation or a government or a nonprofit, every meeting with some acknowledgement that Indigenous people have been here first for thousands of years and have some sort of a way of acknowledging this. And I would never have pictured 40 years ago that it would become as ubiquitous as it has become. So there's plenty of people who say, oh, well, you know, land acknowledgements are not, that's not really reconciliation, that's performative. But it's an element of reconciliation. It's a small step that's easily defined, measurable. People can see when it happens and when it doesn't. And now that we see it, you know, in national broadcasts and hockey games and meetings and critical events. So I think those are the types of things, those are the types of ways we can say, look, we had none of this before. It seems to have caught on. It's present now. And we can at least describe the advancements that we've made in reconciliation in this regard.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think kind of continuing in that same vein, I'm thinking about non-Indigenous peoples across the country and you know, wanting them to feel the responsibility, wanting them to engage in this process as well. And so I know, of course, that the legislation states that the National Council must be 2/3 Indigenous, but that non-Indigenous peoples living in Canada must also participate. What do you envision as the role of non-Indigenous people on the board, the perspective that they can bring in, and how that work, their work can advance reconciliation in an Indigenous-led institution?
Well, it takes two hands to clap, you know. I think you've got, we may define reconciliation in you know, a dozen different ways, but usually it means that there's some sort of interaction, relationship, or conversation between two groups to try and arrive at some kind of mutual understanding. The presence of non-Indigenous people on this council is absolutely critical. They bring a perspective that is obviously different from an Indigenous one. And I think that the kinds of people and the affiliations they have that when they come to the table can really help advance reconciliation purposefully and meaningfully. So I think that the non-Indigenous presence is absolutely clear. We've been saying this since the very beginning, and I think Mitch said it again today. You know, reconciliation for everyone. It's not just an Indigenous issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I guess if I may also add, coming from a women's national perspective, I mean, in order to make a difference in Canada, you need, like Michael says, you need both hands. We are all Canadians, and we have to address this reconciliation effort to change the patterns that we've seen in Canada. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, very briefly, may I add, I think if you look, Mike said earlier, we've been engaged in essentially a 40-year discussion about reconciliation in different ways. And in so many ways, nothing about what Indigenous people have been calling for 40 years has changed to today. We've been saying the exact same things. You hear the things that someone in a position like I have say today are the same things that I heard when I was a kid our leaders say and on before that. And the role for non-Indigenous Canadians not just limited to the role on this council, but the reality being it's non-Indigenous Canadians who have the electoral power to hold governments accountable, to make sure things actually get done. Numbers just don't work out that Indigenous people are going to make or break a government in this country. And so it's in fact, in many ways, it's your government, so hold it accountable. That's the message I say to Canadians all the time. It's your government, so hold them accountable. If reconciliation matters to you, make them do it.
Merci, Monsieur Case. Juste pour vous informer, tous les témoins.
Thank you. I would like to inform you that all the witnesses and members of the committee that there will be no vote at 1 p.m. You won't hear the bells, and so we can continue up until 1 with your testimony. This is now the third round of questions. Mr. Melillo, on my list, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for the incredible testimony so far, and to all my fellow members for their great questions. To that end, much of what I wanted to ask has already been asked, and I appreciate all members doing that work. But I just want to zero in on two topics specifically, that just to delve into a little bit more. And the first around that. The efforts versus advancing versus ensuring, finding those measurable outcomes. And Mr. Degagne, we've heard a number of times in committee that there should be some more measurable outcomes included in this proposal. And I take your comments earlier about some of the challenges around all of the specific wording. But I'm curious if you can elaborate a bit more on the measurable outcomes specifically that you think could potentially be included in C29 in order to make it stronger, so that we can continue to advance efforts, ensuring reconciliation, whatever terminology you want to use, just to make sure that we can get it done.
Well, I think this is the age-old discussion in research about quantitative or qualitative research. And so quantitative tends to have a certain harder quality. You've got, we can quantify something, we can set a measurable target, we know whether we've reached it or not, and we can compare it to other similar circumstances. But I think lately, and certainly around things like healing or reconciliation or self-determination, we may not be able to measure it, but we know it when we see it. And so I think that there's very much there's a meaningful and impactful way to qualitatively assess what kind of reconciliation that we've actually accomplished. The Indigenous community has a very high value on stories and storytelling. And qualitative assessment lends itself to say, tell me how it went, tell me the story. And so I think our organization, once started, will have its role to quantify where it can, but largely to gather and collect stories. It's something that TRC did very, very well. But grab those stories and ensure that we're advancing our cause.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. And sorry, did anyone else want to comment? No. Okay, just one more question, and then if there's any more time remaining, I'll turn it over to Mr. Vidal, because I know he's got a lot of questions. Mr. DeGarnier and I think Mitch Case as well, you both mentioned this about the different pieces of reconciliation, the different sectors, I believe was the word you used, Mr. DeGarnier, in terms of economic reconciliation, land, rights, and to the point that was raised earlier, I won't belabor it, but we have heard folks mention in the committee that there should be a seat at the table or a specific focus around economic reconciliation, but to the point that was mentioned around the different sections on reconciliation, do you believe that there could potentially be a benefit to, and I'll open this up to anyone who has a comment, if there would be a benefit to having more specific seats, not just for economic reconciliation, but for rights as well, and some of those other sectors that you mentioned?
Well, I think the most impactful thing we saw this past summer in terms of reconciliation was the Pope's visit. And so how would we classify what the Pope managed to accomplish while he was here? Maybe spiritual reconciliation or something like that. So, or religious reconciliation. So as many types of reconciliation as you can imagine are there, and we have a sector that supports or represents those different tranches of reconciliation. So I think that what we're looking here is for a general statement to say, look, we understand that we have to have people that represent all of these different sectors, whether it's spiritual or economic or rights-based or self-determining, or and I think what we have here is general enough language to capture it. I wouldn't want to start to put stickers on individual types of reconciliation because I think we may not have enough seats at the table.
Yeah, that's my concern also. You know, if to going to that representation issue and all those different issues, you know, now you're talking about a national council of about 147 people. You know, I think you start to run into problems there if that's the way we're going, and I think we have to have. I think that's where the council, when they get into defining reconciliation, right? And then, you know, there's the board, fine, but they can establish whatever advisory tables they want. They can bring in all the different voices they need to. And I would imagine that makes sense, right? I think you can have that, you know, a panel of experts who advise on where are we at with a rights-based, to Ms. Idlaut's question, right, from a rights-based reconciliation framework, where are we at from a social determinants of health and reconciliation, where are we at with GBA plus in reconciliation, where are we at with economic reconciliation, right? I think we can do all that without having to, I mean, each of you represent all kinds of diverse interests in your constituencies. We don't have to have, 18 members from Kenora because we have you, right? So there can be multiple perspectives represented by different individuals at that table, and there can be ways for more information and more voices to be brought into that process without, greatly, either putting labels on things or, a massive board that would be ungovernable, right? So.
And I'd just like to supplement to that point as well. I mean, just an example with missing and murdered Indigenous women and the inquiry and finding that, the data or the statistics weren't there. So where are the other institutions like federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous right holders monitoring those data? There's already existing institutions that can provide that raw data for ourselves as well. Just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper, and thank you, Mr. Melillo. We'll now go to Mr. McLeod for 5 minutes. Mr. McLeod, I don't know if you can hear me, but you have the microphone for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. No, I couldn't hear you. I do hear you now. I want to thank our presenters today. Very interesting discussion and very important. I attended residential school. My whole family attended residential school. My wife's family attended residential school. And, I got involved in politics at a very young age because I could see the poverty, I could see the struggles that our people were facing, and a lot of our elders always spoke about the agreements that were in place through the treaties and through the Métis script to coexist, and I think they're the reasons that I stayed in politics, because for the longest time it seemed like nobody was listening. So I wanted to ask the question to the committee here about the council and how the elders and the survivors fit into the council. And you know, when the transitional committee was doing their work, did they envision that there would be seats set aside for elders and survivors, or did they see a separate body set up for the elders to be advising and support the NCR?
Well, I want to thank you very much for your question. From up Kenora way, actually, Sulakaut, a good friend of mine, Garnet Anjikaneb, always tells me, you know, don't forget the voices of survivors. And you got into politics because, as you say, nobody was listening to those voices anymore. So I think any council like this has an ongoing obligation to listen to survivors, whether that's of residential schools or the 60 Scoop or the child welfare system. We have those obligations because their voices will be critical in reconciliation. I think what we see in other organizations, for example, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has gone the route of establishing an elders council. I know certainly a lot of universities have. And so I don't know that you want to tie the hands of whatever board comes in, but I think any board that starts this and moves forward with this organization, I think we'll be thinking about the voices of survivors and making sure that they're captured and meaningfully and in an ongoing way in the work of this commission.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure if you answered my question, but I do have other questions regarding the body and the makeup of this council and providing oversight. And, you know, I've been looking at UNDRIP for a long time, and I always expected that there would be an oversight body, a watchdog, because, you know, Indigenous people don't trust governments. And no, I'm not sure if that would be a separate body or it would fall under the responsibility of this council, but there seems to be a lot of oversight that needs to happen. You know, there's truth and reconciliation recommendations, possibly UNDRIP, the 60 Scoop, the murder and missing Indigenous women and girls. That's a lot of oversight to be responsible for. And if there's 9, 10, 12, 14, whatever members, a number of members, it's going to mean a lot of research. It's going to mean a lot of discussions. It's going to mean a lot of updates. It's almost like that's going to be overwhelming for one body to be looking at. And I'm not sure if the board is big enough or what the structure will end up looking like. What is the team? How many staff will be there to provide support? I'm sure you guys have looked at something like that. Are you able to tell me, just give me a general picture of what that would, how that would work?
Okay, I'll start, I guess, is to say that I wouldn't expect that an organization like this, as tempting as it is, would take on all of the oversight of UNDRIP and 60 Scoop and child welfare reform and all of those things. I think certainly the 60 Scoop has its own organization. I know day students have setting up their own. There's going to be, I think, there should be organizations with some advisory or governance relationship with every one of these issues, especially UNDRIP. No, I think this is an organization that'll focus on reconciliation and in all its forms, economic and otherwise. And it would. So I don't think you'd need a staff of all sorts of staff. You'd be focusing on one particular issue.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Nous irons maintenant Madame Gill pour 2 minutes et demie.
Mrs. Gill for 2.5 minutes. Mrs. Gill? Thank you. I wasn't hearing anything. Thank you. My question, one moment, at point 13, for the issue of experience of administrators, it says that we hope to find the required experience. Is this up to the administrators to define what is the desired experience? I understand that the council has not yet been created, but there's something quite vague about Section 13. It doesn't really matter who answers. Thank you.
En fait, c'est la démarche de...
This is a call for nominations of candidates, and this allows for us to see a broad scope of skills and experience that could complement each other within a board with a mandate such as this one, the National Reconciliation Board. I think it's good governance as well to be able to have a diversity of points of view and levels of skill, expertise, and knowledge. But also, as we saw, this is a board that has to put at the heart of its deliberations people itself. So I think that it's quite healthy for good governance to make sure of that. And here, what is suggested is to have different types of candidates and to assess how we can build a board that is able to carry its mandate forward. Thank you. You're answering my question, but at the same time, I'm not sure if you should have added something. You seem to have gone further than my question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is also the idea behind the idea of diversifying. So you talk about experience, skills, this whole issue of skill linked to Indigenous issues. We want allies, but on the board, so do you agree with my understanding that this allows to open up to greater diversity? Yes? Okay. Yes. So that's one thing. I would have another question. I'm sorry. Yes, your time is up. I know it goes by very fast, Mrs. Gill.
Minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to Mitch Case for talking about what life was like before the settlers arrived. That's something I always try to mention in our reports, that I always ask the analysts to say that there was, before colonialism, that Indigenous peoples had thrived. And I think we need to add that in our preamble. Just a quick hint to the whole committee that we should probably add that as well. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the creation of maybe advisory councils to help support the work of the National Reconciliation Council, because we all know that there's going to be a daunting task to ensure that Indigenous peoples feel heard in different areas, especially the elders, especially survivors. But I think that it would seem like a good way to set this framework for this council to do its work. Would you agree that maybe the creation of advisory councils or committees under the council would be a good way to ensure that some of these voices are heard in a direct way?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I do, but I don't think it needs to be in the legislation. I think that's up to the council then to. I wouldn't want to tie their hands with, you have to have these 5, and then they realize they need 7, or. I would just leave it that, that's part of their setting up the the bylaws and all the things of the organization once it's set up. But I do agree, like, I think it kind of needs to happen. But
I guess a follow-up question to that, would you be concerned that the council would not have the resources it needs to make sure that it can hear from these kinds of groups because it's not identified in the legislation?
To speak very candidly, my concern is that the budget won't be big enough to do all of the things that it's being asked to do. Not that they won't know that they need to do that work, right? It's just that they won't have the resources to do it. That's my, speaking very frankly and very candidly, that's my concern. Not so much the, does it need to be prescribed that they will talk to elders? It's, will they have the resources to do it? Or will they have the resources to do the language component on all those other things? So.
Yeah, my interest is to make sure that the council gets as much resources as it needs, and maybe as a way to ensure that is to say that at least some committees will need to be created to give advice to the council, such as those from elders, those from survivors, because we know that those are very important groups that this council will need to hear from and be advised about through this work. Maybe we could make sure that the legislation is drafted in a way to not restrict who these committees might be, but to ensure that resources are provided to ensure that the advice could be provided from as broad a range as possible.
Thank you, Ms. Laut. We'll now go to Mr. Vidal for 5 minutes.
Actually, Chair, I think Gary and I just quickly switched. Sorry about that.
Go ahead, Mr. Schmale.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again, witnesses. I want to continue on the path regarding the composition of the board. We've heard from a number of different groups, and I know this question has come up a few times today. Questions and comments from other groups, such as the Native Women's Association of Canada. We've heard from groups talking about reconciliation, specifically economic and fiscal. I'm still concerned that the composition, especially at the beginning, probably some of the most important stages are being left out, especially on the Native women's side, who I feel have a very legitimate grievance that they are being left out of this. So I'd like your comments. Maybe Mr. Degonge, we can start with you and then go along the table if we need to.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I think it'll be clear that this is not a representative board. This is a board that is there to govern this particular council. So what that means is that regardless of where you come from, whether you're formerly a member of the Native Women's Association or if you are affiliated with the Métis National Council, any of those sorts of things, you come to this board, you take your hat off, and you sit as a member of that board, and you act in the best interests of that organization collectively. That's certainly how been my experience with other boards, is that, you know, we set aside our particular needs to advocate on behalf of an organization. So whether or not there's a formal seat for the Native Women's Association does not speak to whether or not Native women will be accounted for in the work of the council. Certainly, there will, as Rosemary, has pointed out before, we're looking at this through a gender lens. There will be Native women on this council. They will speak for themselves and their experiences. And so, and besides that, if we're operating as a governing board and someone comes there and only wants to advocate for one particular organization, then they're in a conflict with the goals and objectives of the organization. So they'll have to, set their voice aside for that purpose. So we cannot have an organization that represents everyone. It would be a cast of thousands. But we can have an organization that attempts to speak through, their own experiences on behalf of everyone. That's what we're looking for. So I think that the notion of representation, I think we can set that aside and stick with things like, what accounts for good governance here and how people can act in the best interests of reconciliation.
But if a group like this is representing 50% of the population, I'm sure you can understand their concerns.
I don't know who they claim to represent. I don't know who any of the political organizations, whether or not everyone is affiliated with them just because they fall under that umbrella. I would say that if more than 50% or if there's 50% of this board that winds up to be Native women, I think that they will do an adequate job, more than adequate job, of speaking for the interests of them Native women. And not just interests, but speaking through the lens that they bring in that regard.
But in terms of when you say speaking for the larger group, like for example, we're talking First Nations, the majority of the population lives off reserve in urban centers. So it would make sense if we're talking about that. So why would we close this off? We have, when I talk about 50% of the population, you say 50% is male, 50% is female, roughly, give or take. And there are groups that are saying, hey, we kind of represent or are engaged in different segments of the Indigenous population, whether it be off reserve and urban centers. We're talking about governance issues, et cetera, that might want a seat or even a voice at the table at this very important time, rather than leaving it up to just a small group to set the stage for future discussions.
I'll just respond that this is the board that we're looking at is not political in nature. That we've outlined the different sectors of society and Canadian in general that we want to see the board come to fruition with. So the board will have many hats that they will play a role here in representation, but it was important for the interim board not to have political hats at this, but a commitment to the different sectors of Canadian that we want to see here going forward.
Je ne sais pas si je peux me permettre un commentaire.
Could I make a comment? Yes, go ahead, Mrs. Cloutier. I would have a comment. Reconciliation requires collective action, collective effort. It requires a sustained effort throughout time, but also a will to experiment and to take unexplored paths in ways to work together and to be innovative in the way that we move forward with reconciliation. And this rests on trust. It rests on trust and complementarity of people who want to contribute to this greater goal of reconciliation. So I think that we have an opportunity here. I have 3 or 4 of the boxes that I can. I'm Francophone, an Indigenous woman. So diversity, we're 50-50 men and women here. I think that we have to trust each other and believe that we will have the ability, the opportunity, and the will and the innovation necessary to complete a board that will be representative of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Thank you.
Mr. Schmale. We have one last 5-minute slot on the Liberal side for Mr. Pawlowski.
Well, the Conservatives, as usual, are going to like my question, but I think you're going to have a good response to what's really their question, which is obviously the first board has a lot of power to establish the agenda to come for future boards. And under Section 8, it's the minister in conjunction with your board that has the power to appoint the people on that first board, which is going to set the menu for boards to come. What can you tell us to reassure us that this isn't going to be a total political thing, that the Liberals appoint all their people and it very much just reflects our agenda rather than the greater agenda?
Well, because then I'd quit.
No, we've as was earlier asked, we've had a very positive relationship with the minister. We've been set on, I think, the right course, and there's been a sense of, look, this is what we need. This is for the good of the good of the general good, and set us up so that we have an organization that can, govern itself long into the future. So I don't have any concerns about any sort of wild cards that are going to come out of the selection process to begin the board. But I mean, these boards will change. They'll adapt. They'll adapt to the common good that's going to be represented by those board directors. So I have full confidence that it'll work out well.
Mr. Case said when he was talking about functions of the council, one of the important functions of the council was to tell groups that want to do something how they can do it. And certainly, and as the Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Rainy River, I'm certainly aware of the fact that bad news rapidly spreads, but examples of good news of reconciliation often doesn't get around nearly as well. Now, how is the council going to advertise those positive messages, the examples where there has been productive efforts for reconciliation? Is that the role of the council? In saying that, I worked in Laos once, and I was rather amused to hear from someone from the government that there is the Ministry of Propaganda. I thought, what? The Ministry of Propaganda? But certainly you don't want the council to just be a propaganda organization that just tells the good news as to what happens. But how do you get that out? And would it require an administration and people in order to communicate, for example, to schools, to businesses, to various other groups, examples of how, if they want to do something, they can do it effectively?
I'll take a crack at it. I think partly that role outlined in that first section is around sort of the convening function of the council, to bring conversations together, to highlight work that's happening, to not, as Mike said, to not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel every time. If there's something really positive happening if there's one university that's really found a way forward, then let's promote that work, right? And if there's an example of economic reconciliation happening somewhere, let's promote that work. While at the same time, being aware of and monitoring those things that are mentioned in Call to Action 55, incarceration rates, child welfare, all those numbers that are incredibly crucial to these conversations. But it's like my elders tell me, we get the right answers because we know how to ask the right questions. And so we can't have the reconciliation conversation in this country. This is my personal opinion, but we can't have the reconciliation conversation in this country continue to be one that is essentially Indigenous people putting our trauma on display for Canadians to consume, feel really bad, go home, and nothing changes. So we can't have that. We need to have productive conversations that are about, here are where things are working, here are where things aren't. Why aren't they working? Let's fix them, and where they are, let's foster that and encourage that growth, right? Now, how that's accomplished where the rubber hits the road, that's up to the council to determine when they're established. How they did the really good work Mike led at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. I've still got the printed documents we used to get from them that were, back then, that was cutting edge, that we got a paper report. That's a long time ago, right? And so the mechanisms and the means of telling the stories, as Mike talked about, are changing and shifting and will continue to grow. But I think that's really what it's about, is getting to the stories. And sometimes those stories are horrific, and sometimes they're, look at what's happening here, this is awesome, we want to support it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pawlowski. That brings our panel to an end, and I want to, on behalf of all of the committee members, thank our witnesses today. Merci beaucoup d'être venu. On est très, très content.
Thank you so much for being here. We're so happy that you were able to take the time to come and inform us and to provide us explanations as to how you helped in preparing this bill in the way that you did.
answering all of our questions today. I think you cleared up a lot of things for a lot of us in terms of understanding, the why you helped formulate the proposed Bill C-29 the way it has been put together. So thank you very, very much. A real pleasure meeting all of you today, and this will really help us with our work. And for the committee members, the decision was taken by the whips that we would not hold committee meetings this Thursday when the fall economic statement is being presented. As a result of that, the clause by clause will move to Monday, the 14th of November. I would like to also point out that this gives us a little more time, especially after hearing today's testimony, to put together proposed amendments, which were due tomorrow at noon. I would like to see if there is consensus for us to move the deadline for amendments to the 7th at noon, which would give a little bit more time, or if you would prefer to keep it on the 1st of November. So are there any comments with respect to that?
Ms. Idlet has a comment.
I would love
Go ahead, Ms. Idlet.
I would love the extension to November 7.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who objects to that? This will give us enough time, the legislative clerk, to receive all of them, and you must respect that noon on the 7th deadline, then for all of us to receive those amendments and give us a little bit of time to look at them before we go clause by clause on the 14th. So not hearing any objections.
There's nodding around the table, sir, so I think there's unanimous consent.
Very good. Thank you. So just a final repetition, the 7th at noon, please get your amendments in by then. Thank you. And with that, this panel is adjourned.